This video will discuss proportions, and proportions are related to ratios in the sense that a proportion is setting two ratios equal to one another. So if, for instance, you have a ratio A over B and you set it equal to the ratio C over D, then in order to solve this proportion, we would essentially cross multiply and get that AD is equal to BC, and we can solve from there. So if you look at this first example, we have 25 over 96 is equal to 75 over x. So if we cross multiply, we end up with 25x is equal to 75 times 96. I'm just going to leave it like that for a moment. Then if we're trying to solve for x, we will divide by 25. Again, our rules of algebra, and we end up with x. Well, we can simplify this, and we see that 75 divided by 25 is simply 3 over 1. So we get 3 times 96, which is simply 288. And this makes sense. 25 times 3 would get you 275. 96 times 3 would get you to 288. So this is our value for x, and this is how we would solve the proportion. Now this next example only involves variables or letters, which is fine. We still want to solve for x. So in this case we have AX is equal to BC. If we want to solve for x, we divide both sides by A, BC over A. And we can just leave it simply like that. With the next example, it's a little bit more involved just because our denominator here is a little bit more involved, but we're going to follow the same process. One thing to keep in mind with this is we can only cross multiply, if you want to call it that, when you have a fraction equal to a fraction. If you have anything else involved in here that's in addition to the fraction, then we cannot use this process. We need to simplify first. So in this case, if we cross multiply, we get 3x is equal to 1 times 8 minus x. So if we simplify, we get 3x is equal to 8 minus x. Let's add this x to both sides, and we end up with 4x is equal to 8. Finally, if you divide both sides by 4, you find that x is equal to 2. And we can check ourselves over here. If we plug it back in, 2 divided by 8 minus 2 would come out to be 2/6, which reduces to be 1/3, and that's what we have on the right side. We can also do applications of proportions. Now, before the days of Google Maps and GPS, we did use maps quite often, and there's some fields that still do. So it's important to remember that on any map that you look at, these aren't drawn to scale. You're looking at miniature versions. And so suppose you're looking at a map in which 1/4 of an inch represents 25 miles. We want to know what distance is represented by 2 1/8 of an inch. So now we can set up our own proportion. We are going to compare the inches to miles, essentially. So we are going to have 1/4, and I'm going to write this as a decimal, 1/4 of an inch compared to 25 miles is equal to, well, inches here would be 2.125, and we're looking for x. We want to know what distance this represents in miles. And you could probably see that we're just going to move the decimal place 2 places, but let's check ourselves here. If we cross multiply, we get 0.25x is equal to 25 times 2.125, and then we divide both sides by 0.25, and we end up with x being 212.5, and in this case miles, because that's the unit that x was in. And this makes sense. Again, we just had to move that decimal place 2 places over to get our distance in miles. Try a few more examples here. Sam and Kara work painting a house. Sam worked for 8 hours, Kara worked for 10 hours. They're paid $450 for their work. How much should Sam receive, and how much should Kara receive if they're being paid the same hourly rate? So in this case, we need to be careful here because they got a total of $450 for a total of 18 hours worked, 10 and 8. So that's what we need to compare, $450 for 18 hours of work. So if we want to find out how much Sam needs to be paid, then we would put Sam up top and we would divide by the 8 hours that Sam worked. So now if we cross multiply, we have 450 times 8 is equal to 18s, and we divide by 18, and we find that Sam should earn $200. Now you can set up the other ratio or simply say that the remaining money from the $450 will go to Kara, so 450 minus our 200 is $250 that Kara would receive. And we could check this by setting up the ratio. This should also equal Kara divided by 10 hours. And if you check all of these, 250 divided by 10 is 25, that 450 divided by 18 is 25, and that the 200 that Sam earned divided by 8 would also be 25. So these are the two amounts that the painters earn. Try a few more examples. If 12 machines can produce 27,000 bolts in 6 hours, how many bolts can be produced in 10 hours? So there's some extra information here. Namely, at least in the first part, we don't really need to know that there are 12 machines. We just need to know that in 6 hours we produce 27,000 bolts. And we compare this to the 10 hours that we're going to have and divided by X. So we'll call this part A. Again, if we cross multiply, we end up with 6x is equal to 27,000 times 10. Divide both sides by 6, and we end up with x being 45,000. And again, we need our units, bolts. So that's part A of this problem. Part B instead says, how many machines would it take to increase production to those 45,000 bolts in 6 hours? So in this case, the 6 hours is irrelevant. We just need to compare the number of bolts to the number of machines. So I want you to pause the video here and see if you can get part B. So setting up similar proportions, we should have found that we need 20 machines to increase production of 45,000 bolts in 6 hours. And this makes sense because there's nearly double the amount of bolts and you would need almost double the amount of machines to do this work. Two more examples to work through here. We want to find the ratio of the length and the width of a rectangular field is given to be 5 to 6. We want to find the dimensions of the field if the perimeter is 4,400 meters. Now we have to be very careful here. Let's draw a picture. We've got a rectangular field which has a ratio of 5 to 6. I'm going to call this X and this Y. And we know that the perimeter is equal to 4,400. Well, we also know that the perimeter should be 2x plus 2y. Again, the 5 and 6 are just proportions. And we know that any perimeter is twice the base times twice the height. So we can do some simplification here. First of all, we know that we have this ratio of 5 to 6 is equal to y over x. Again, 5 is corresponding to y, 6 is corresponding to x. So we can cross multiply here and see that 5x is equal to 6y. Now that we have this information, we can plug it into the perimeter equation, and it's up to you which one you plug in for. In this case, I would solve for x here to get that x is equal to 6y over 5, and then we can substitute in here. So the perimeter, which we know is 4,400, is equal to 2 times this 6y over 5 plus 2 times y. So if we simplify here, we have 4,400 is equal to 12y over 5 if we multiply. Plus, let's do a common denominator here, 10y over 5. 2y would convert to be 10y over 5. And this would simplify to be 22y over 5. So in this case, we end up with 4,400 is equal to 22y over 5. We can then multiply by this 5/22 to get rid of it on the right side. And we end up with y being approximately 1,000 meters. And if this is the case, we can plug it back into our original, or we can plug it back in over here and say that we have 6 times 1,000 divided by 5, which comes out to be 1,200. And this units, again, are meters. And this makes sense. If you have 2 times 1,000, you get 2,000, and 2 times 1,200, you get 2,400. 2,400 and 2,000 would give you your total 4,400 meters. One last example here, a triangle whose sides are the ratio 3, 4, 5, so that's that Pythagorean triple that we've talked about before, is a right triangle. If length of the hypotenuse is 90 meters instead of 5, so again, we've got a similar triangle here, what are the lengths of the other two sides? So I want you to pause the video here and see if you can get this example, find the other two sides, and then resume the video to determine if you have the correct answer. So you should have set up two ratios in this case, or two proportions in this case. Either way, you should have ended up with that smallest side being 54 meters and the middle side being 72 meters. So this concludes the video on proportions. Please go online and do the homework for section 114, and then watch the video for section 115.